The slag field stretched for half a mile east of the furnace line. No grass grew there. Nothing did. The ground was black and porous. A calcified crust formed over decades of poured waste, of molten refuse dumped from ladles the size of houses, cooling in slow orange rivers until they hardened into something that looked, from a distance, like earth. It was not earth. In the autumn of 1937, a crew of maintenance workers tasked with laying a drainage conduit through the southern edge of the Carnegie steel slag deposit at Homestead, Pennsylvania, struck something beneath the surface at a depth of 4 feet. It was not stone, it was not pipe, it was not the iron-rich debris that routinely turned up when men dug anywhere near the plant's waste fields. It was bone. By the following morning, the foreman had called a halt to the work. By afternoon, a second set of remains had surfaced 12 feet to the west. Within 72 hours of that first strike, investigators catalogued the partial skeletal remnants of 11 individuals. Within the next 6 weeks, as excavation widened and deepened across a quarter-acre grid, that number climbed, 40 bodies in total. Some had been there for decades. The slag that encased them had poured at temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Certain remains had been partially vitrified, fused, not buried, not hidden so much as absorbed, consumed by the industrial process that had defined this place since 1881, when Andrew Carnegie's mill first lit its furnaces and began its 50-year transformation of American steel and of the men it ground through to produce it. No investigation was ever formally opened. No names were ever officially confirmed. The drainage conduit was rerouted, the excavation was filled, and the mill went on producing. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not require intention. It requires only scale. Carnegie Steel's Homestead plant produced, at its peak, over 4 million tons of structural steel per year. For every ton of finished steel, the smelting process generated approximately 1/2 ton of slag. The waste compound of silica, lime, alumina, and metal oxides skimmed or poured from the surface of molten iron. Over 50 years of continuous operation, the Homestead plant displaced an estimated 97 million cubic feet of slag onto the fields east and south of its furnace row. At that volume, the ground does not bury things deliberately, it simply rises, and what was once visible, a man, a tool, a record, becomes in time geology, becomes substrate, becomes the very foundation upon which more production is built, more waste is poured, more years accumulate like sediment over something. No one has agreed to forget, but no one has found reason to remember. Before the steel came, Homestead was a town of market gardens and river ferries, situated 8 miles east of Pittsburgh along the southern bank of the Monongahela River. It had been settled in the 1820s by German and Scots-Irish farming families who recognized the land's fertility and the river's commercial utility. By 1870, its population stood at just under 900. Its streets were unpaved. Its economy was modest, local, and largely self-contained. Then the river began to matter for a different reason. The Monongahela offered what the steel industry required above almost everything else: bulk, water transport for raw materials, iron ore moving south from the Lake Superior ranges, limestone hauled from quarries in western Pennsylvania, coke, processed coal, barged up from the Connellsville district where the seams ran thick and sulfur low, ideal for the chemistry of a blast furnace. By 1880, land speculation had already begun along Homestead's eastern flats. The farms were bought. The ferries stopped running. What replaced them would operate continuously for the next half-century, and it would consume the town as completely as it consumed the ore. Andrew Carnegie did not build Homestead Steel Works. He acquired it in 1883, 2 years after the plant's original owners had raised its first furnace stack on the Monongahela Flats. Carnegie bought the facility outright for a sum his own accountants considered excessive. Within 18 months, he had doubled its capacity. Within 5 years, he had made it the most productive steel plant in the Western Hemisphere. The method was not mystery. It was pressure, applied without pause. Carnegie understood, with a precision that bordered on the clinical, that the cost of steel fell in direct proportion to the volume produced. Every idle hour in a furnace cycle was money dissolved. Every worker injury that halted a casting line was a subtraction from the ledger. The plant ran on 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The furnaces did not cool, the ladles did not rest. By 1892, Homestead employed over 3,800 men across its rolling mills, open hearth furnaces, and slag handling operations. Their average wage had fallen, in real terms, by 31% since Carnegie's acquisition. Production in the same period had risen by 400%. The slag system at Homestead was not an afterthought, it was an infrastructure. Every blast furnace at the plant produced a continuous flow of molten waste, a byproduct of the chemical reaction between iron ore, coke, and limestone inside the furnace stack. At temperatures between 2,600 and 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit, the impurities in the ore separated from the liquid iron and rose to the surface in a dense, luminous mass. This was the slag. It had to be moved, and it had to be moved constantly, because accumulation inside the furnace meant pressure, and pressure meant catastrophic failure. Purpose-built rail cars, slag pots mounted on flatbed frames, received the poured waste directly from the furnace tap holes. Each pot held between 8 and 16 tons of material in full liquid state. Teams of pot handlers guided the cars along dedicated narrow gauge tracks that ran from the furnace floor out across the eastern waste fields, where the contents were tipped and left to cool. In practice, the dump sites received multiple pours per shift, new slag poured over old slag, layers compacted under their own weight. Over decades, they built upward and outward simultaneously, an expanding terrain of industrial residue that hardened on the surface while remaining, at depth, structurally unpredictable. Men worked those fields every day. The slag fields at Homestead possessed a deceptive stability. From the furnace floor, from the mill superintendent's office, from the administrative buildings that lined Carnegie Street, the waste deposits appeared solid. They had the look of settled ground, dark, compressed, permanent. Men walked them daily. Narrow gauge tracks crossed them without incident for years at a stretch. Supervisors assigned maintenance crews to their surface without hesitation, without survey, without engineering assessment of what lay beneath. What lay beneath was not solid. Slag cools from the outside inward. A pour that appeared hardened at the surface within 12 hours could retain a molten or semi-molten interior for days. In thicker accumulations, and after 50 years of continuous deposit, sections of the Homestead fields reached depths exceeding 30 feet. The internal temperature gradient remained dangerously unstable for far longer than any operational protocol acknowledged. A man who stepped through the surface crust entered a thermal environment from which recovery was, in most circumstances, impossible. There were no formal inspection protocols for the waste fields. There were no depth surveys. There were no temperature monitoring systems deployed below the surface layer. There was, instead, a working assumption, shared between management and, by necessity, labor, that the ground was sound because it had not yet visibly failed. It was an assumption the ground periodically disproved. The slag handlers at Homestead occupied the lowest stratum of an already brutalized labor hierarchy. They were disproportionately recent immigrants, Hungarian, Slovak, Polish, Croatian men who had arrived in southwestern Pennsylvania through labor contractor networks that promised wages and delivered, instead, the worst assignments the plant could offer. Men who spoke limited English had limited recourse. Men without recourse were placed where the work was hottest, most physical, and least supervised. A slag handler's shift began before the furnace tap and ended after the last pour cooled enough to approach. He wore no heat-resistant clothing beyond what he could improvise: leather scraps, canvas wraps, boots resoled with whatever material held longest against radiant ground temperatures that routinely exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. His life expectancy inside the plant, according to actuarial records filed by Carnegie Steel's own insurance contractors in 1899, was statistically indistinguishable from that of men engaged in active mining operations. He was paid, on average, 140 cents per day. When he did not return from the fields, the most common entry in the shift ledger was a single word: absent. When the drainage crew broke ground in October of 1937, the Homestead plant had been operating under United States Steel Corporation ownership for 36 years. Carnegie had sold his empire in 1901 for $480 million, the largest private industrial transaction in American history to that point. The furnaces had changed hands, the letterhead had changed, the slag fields had not changed at all, they had only grown. The crew foreman who identified the first remains was a man named Victor Poulsen, the son of a Slovak immigrant, who had himself worked the Homestead Open Hearth division for 22 years. Poulsen filed a written report with the plant's safety office within hours of the discovery. He received a verbal acknowledgement by the following morning. Nothing else followed. No county coroner was formally notified. No state labor inspector was summoned. The Pittsburgh newspapers, two of which maintained reporters assigned to the steel industry, published nothing. The plant's internal safety log for October and November 1937, later reviewed by a single labor historian in 1974, recorded the excavation stoppage as a drainage routing adjustment. 40 sets of remains, one routing adjustment. The silence that followed was not panicked or conspiratorial. It was something more durable than either. It was institutional. It was practiced. It was the silence of an industry that had long since concluded that certain costs did not require accounting. No criminal investigation was opened at Homestead in 1937. No investigation was opened in 1938 or in the years that followed as the plant continued operating and the slag fields continued expanding. The 40 sets of remains recovered during the drainage excavation were not formally identified, not publicly catalogued, and not returned to families, because no mechanism existed to determine which families to notify, and no institutional will existed to construct one. Pennsylvania's labor safety statutes in 1937 contained provision compelling a private industrial operator to report human remains discovered on company property. The gap was not accidental. It was the cumulative result of 5 decades of legislative lobbying by the steel industry, lobbying that had successfully ensured that the legal definition of an industrial accident remained enough to exclude the category of worker whose disappearance was never formally recorded as an accident in the first place. The men in the slag had never officially died at Homestead. They had simply stopped appearing in the ledger. You cannot investigate the death of a man whose employment record contains only one word: absent. The Homestead Steel Works ceased operations in 1986. The furnaces were decommissioned. The rolling mills were demolished. The narrow-gauge slag tracks were pulled from the ground and sold for scrap. In their place, eventually, came a shopping complex, a retail development constructed on ground that had never been formally surveyed, never been archaeologically assessed, never been legally compelled to yield its record. The slag fields are still there, beneath the foundations. What they contain beyond those 40 catalogued remains is unknown. The labor historian who reviewed the 1937 safety logs estimated, based on disappearance rates cross-referenced against shift records from 1882 to 1931, that the actual figure could be 3 times higher. His paper was published in an academic journal with a circulation of 400. No wider inquiry followed. The ground at Homestead does not volunteer information. It holds what was given to it, compressed under its own accumulated weight, calcified into something that resembles permanence, the way institutional silence always does, eventually, from a sufficient distance.